Bipartisan negotiators are meeting this afternoon to discuss the framework for a gun reform bill. They're trying to get it ready for a vote next week.
The lead Republican negotiator says some provisions could be dropped from the framework if lawmakers remain at an impasse. Texas Senator John Cornyn explained why the so-called boyfriend loophole is complicating the negotiations.
That's part of the problem. There's current relationships that are covered by the law, and the Democrats want to define other relationships, and it's a little bit vague, and I think we need some clarity.
Lead Democratic negotiator Senator Chris Murphy said Wednesday lawmakers can work out any disagreements about the potential bill. Joining us now is CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, thanks so much for being with us. So explain the so-called boyfriend loophole and why it has become a sticking point for lawmakers.
Hey, Elaine. Well, this is essentially a provision in this framework that would essentially try to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. And as you can see from, or as you can hear from what Cornyn said, they're squabbling over the language of what actually constitutes a domestic kind of partner. And so that's really what they're trying to iron out here. Now, this is a provision that Democrats have tried to pass several times before. They have tried to put it in the Violence Against Women Act and have had to take it out several times because it wasn't getting the support from Republicans. So this has been an issue that has really long been a sticking point here. And so, as you say, the negotiators are expected to meet this afternoon to try to hammer out some details, but they know that the pressure is really on to get that framework into actual legislative text. And that also shows that an agreement on principles is very different from legislative language, and that's where we're seeing some of these sticking points emerge. Now, earlier there were some disagreements over the red flag provisions. This is an incentive for states, funding essentially for states to implement their own red flag laws. They seem to have ironed those difficulties out, so the real sticking point remains this so-called boyfriend loophole. So we'll see if lawmakers are able to come to a conclusion. They have been hoping to get a bill by the end of this week, really, and hoping to pass this overall legislation by the end of the month before they head out onto July 4th recess.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about, because, you know, what's quite stunning is there's one study that links domestic violence to 2/3 of mass shootings. So it's clear why there would be interest to address that. Senator Cornyn, though, said this afternoon's meeting isn't necessarily make or break for the bill, but could impact the timeline. What does that all mean? Could a vote next week now be off the table?
Yeah, that's a good question, Errol. And what he was suggesting was, look, there are still some details to be worked out. And eventually, if they're not able to be worked out, they could drop them for the overall bill. But lawmakers are still very adamant that they want to get some kind of deal done. And they've been working this week to try to sell their other colleagues. That's why it was really critical for this bill that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell came out earlier this week and said he supported the framework in general, and that would give some political cover for some Republicans who are very, very wary about going against the right flank of the party, especially as we're in the middle of primary season and heading into midterm season. So lawmakers also know that the biggest impediment to legislation and deals like this is the more time passes, the more the pressure kind of relents. And so they really want to nail down this legislative language to get it to a point where they can go back to lawmakers and say, look, these are the final details, and then have it for a vote. Now, Schumer, the majority leader, says that he wants to put this to a vote on the floor as soon as possible. So again, eyeing before the end of the month, because once they go out on recess, that makes these negotiations even more difficult.
And Caitlin, as you mentioned, I mean, looming over all of this is the fact that we do have midterm elections in the not too distant future. So how might that actually shape what winds up ultimately in this bill?
Yeah, it has a huge impact, Elaine. I mean, we're right in the middle of Republican primaries. We were just reporting on some earlier this week. And so for Republicans, the politics here really, essentially gets in the way. And that's why a lot of Democrats working on this legislation saw that move by McConnell to, give his blessing essentially to the framework of this bill as a way to say to other Republicans who may be concerned about voting for something like this that, look, it's okay. McConnell, of course, is someone who is paying very close attention to the politics going on in the Republican Party in these midterm races, because he very much wants to be majority leader, very much, of course, wants Republicans to gain seats in the Senate. And so that is a consideration, looming over all of this. And we'll see by the end of today if they are one step closer to getting actual legislative text.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you very much.